What actually kills an empire? Is it military defeat? Economic collapse? A single catastrophic war? The answer is far more unsettling than that. Empires rarely die from external threats. They die from a very specific type of internal delusion, a miscalculation so profound that it sets in motion an irreversible chain of events. And here's what should keep you up at night. The British Empire made this exact mistake between 1945 and 1956. They refused to accept reality. They doubled down when they should have adapted. They confused activity with strategy. And today, in 2026, we're watching another superpower walk down the same path. I'm not talking about a surface-level comparison. I'm talking about the same structural pressures, the same psychological traps, the same institutional inertia that transforms rational actors into architects of their own decline. This is the story of how empires make their final mistake, and why it's almost impossible to avoid. Let's go back to September 1945. World War II has just ended. Britain is on the winning side. Churchill is a global hero. The Union Jack still flies over a quarter of the world's land surface. But here's what most people don't understand. Britain was already finished. They just didn't know it yet. The war had cost Britain nearly everything. A quarter of their national wealth was gone. They owed the United States more money than their entire economy could generate in a year. The Royal Navy, once the symbol of British dominance, was now smaller than the US Navy. The British Army was exhausted. But the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is about psychology. British leadership in 1945 genuinely believed they were still a global superpower. Not a declining one, an actual superpower equal to the United States and the Soviet Union. They called it the Big Three. And they believed it. This wasn't stupidity. These were sophisticated, intelligent people. Clement Attlee, Ernest Bevin, the entire British foreign policy establishment, they weren't idiots. They had access to all the data showing British decline. So why couldn't they see what was happening? Here's the first psychological trap: institutional memory. The people running Britain in 1945 had spent their entire careers in a British-dominated world. They had governed empires, commanded fleets, shaped global events. Their entire framework for understanding international relations assumed British centrality. When you've spent 30, 40 years operating as the dominant power, you don't just rationally update your beliefs when the data changes. Your entire cognitive architecture resists the new reality. Think about it. If you spent your whole career as the boss, the decision maker, the one everyone deferred to, and suddenly you're not, your brain doesn't just accept that. It finds explanations, it rationalizes, it tells you this is temporary, that the fundamentals haven't changed, that you just need to be more assertive. This is what happened to Britain. The second trap was even more insidious: the commitment trap. Britain had military bases in 70 countries. They had treaty obligations across the globe. They had promised to defend territories from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. Now imagine you're a British policymaker in 1946. Someone suggests you abandon half these commitments. What do you think happens? Immediately, you face a cascade of objections. If we withdraw from Greece, the Soviets will take over. If we leave Palestine, there will be chaos. If we abandon India, we'll lose all credibility. Every commitment we give up makes the next withdrawal harder. Our allies will lose faith. Our enemies will be emboldened. Each individual commitment seems defensible. Each withdrawal seems dangerous. So you keep everything. This is how rational actors make irrational choices. Not through stupidity, but through the compounding logic of individual rational decisions that collectively create an unsustainable system. All of this came to a head in 1956 at Suez. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal. This was Britain's strategic lifeline, the route to India, to oil, to everything that remained of their global position. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden decided to take it back by force. He colluded with France and Israel in a secret plan to invade Egypt, overthrow Nasser, and reassert British control. The operation was militarily successful. British and French forces secured the Canal Zone. And then the United States said, "Stop, not a suggestion, an order." President Eisenhower threatened to destroy the British pound. He threatened to cut off oil supplies. He made it absolutely clear: withdraw or face economic catastrophe. Britain had no choice. They withdrew. This was the moment Britain had to confront what they'd been avoiding for a decade. They were no longer a superpower. They couldn't act independently of American approval. The empire was over. But here's the haunting part. Even after Suez, many in the British establishment didn't fully accept it. They spoke of east of Suez commitments. They maintained the delusion for another decade. So what's the pattern here? First, objective decline that contradicts subjective identity. Second, institutional structures built for a different era that resist change. Third, a cascade of commitments that seem individually necessary but collectively unsustainable. Fourth, a crisis that forces confrontation with reality. And finally, even after the crisis, continued resistance to the new order. Remember this pattern. We're going to see it again. Now let's jump forward to 1991. The Soviet Union has just collapsed. The Cold War is over. America stands alone as the sole superpower. Francis Fukuyama writes, "The end of history. American triumphalism reaches heights not seen since 1945. And here's where the parallel begins. Just as Britain in 1945 couldn't see their decline, America in 1991 made assumptions about their dominance that would shape the next 30 years. The assumption was this: American hegemony was the natural state of the international system. It wasn't temporary or contingent. It was the endpoint of historical development. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a rational conclusion based on the evidence. America had the world's largest economy, most powerful military, most advanced technology, and most attractive culture. No competitor was even close. But remember the British trap. When you're at the peak, you can't imagine the descent. In the 1990s, America began expanding its commitments. NATO expanded eastward. The US took on peacekeeping in the Balkans. They maintained troops in South Korea, Japan, Germany. They guaranteed the security of Saudi Arabia, Israel, Taiwan. Then came September 11th, 2001. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq weren't just military campaigns. They were expressions of a worldview, that America could reshape entire regions through force, that American power was unlimited, that the unipolar moment would last forever. Sound familiar? Just like Britain maintaining global commitments they couldn't afford, America built a security architecture that assumed unlimited resources and unlimited will. But something else was happening. Something that should have been obvious but was largely ignored. China was rising, not slowly, not gradually, faster than any economy in human history. In 1991, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. By 2026, it's the second largest in the world, and by some measures, already surpassing America's in purchasing power parity. China built the world's largest navy by ship count. They developed advanced missiles specifically designed to counter American carriers. They created economic dependencies through the Belt and Road Initiative. They challenged the dollar's dominance through alternative payment systems. This is the revisionist power, the challenger to the established order. And here's where the parallel becomes terrifying. Just as Britain had institutional structures that resisted acknowledging decline, so does America. The Pentagon's planning documents still assume global dominance. The foreign policy establishment still speaks of American leadership as an unquestioned given. The defense budget reflects commitments across the globe, but the fundamentals have shifted. America's share of global GDP has declined from nearly 40% in 1945 to around 25% today. The defense industrial base has atrophied. America can't build ships as fast as China. The political will for overseas interventions has collapsed after Iraq and Afghanistan. And yet the commitments remain. Defend Taiwan, maintain NATO, support Ukraine, counter Iran, contain China, secure sea lanes, uphold the international order. Each commitment individually has a strategic rationale, but collectively they're unsustainable. This is the British trap, updated for the 21st century. So where is America's Suez moment? Maybe it's already happened and we didn't recognize it. Was it Afghanistan in 2021 when America withdrew in chaos after 20 years? Or maybe it's still coming. Imagine a crisis over Taiwan. China moves to blockade or invade. America faces a choice: intervene and risk a great power war, or stand down and accept the end of American dominance in the Pacific. If America intervenes, they face a peer competitor with geographic advantage fighting on their doorstep. If America doesn't intervene, every ally questions American commitments, and the unipolar order ends definitively. This is the same choice Britain faced at Suez. Maintain the pretense of power and risk catastrophe, or accept reduced status. There's no good option. That's the point. Let me be clear about something. This isn't about American weakness or failure. This is about the mathematics of power transition. No hegemonic power in history has maintained its position indefinitely. Not Rome, not Britain, not anyone. The costs of maintaining global order eventually exceed the benefits. Rivals catch up. Overstretch becomes unsustainable. The question is never whether decline happens. The question is how the declining power responds. Britain's mistake wasn't that they declined. Their mistake was refusing to adapt to decline. They spent the 1950s pretending they were still a superpower, wasting resources on commitments they couldn't sustain, until reality forced a humiliating adjustment. America is at risk of making the same mistake. Let's dig deeper into the psychology here because this is crucial. Why do intelligent, informed leaders consistently make this error? The first reason is what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've invested enormous resources in a particular strategy or set of commitments, abandoning them feels like admitting failure. The more you've invested, the harder it is to walk away. Britain had invested centuries in building their empire. Walking away meant acknowledging that all that sacrifice, all those resources, all those lives were for a system that was ending. America has invested 75 years in building the post-World War II order. Walking away means acknowledging that the unipolar moment was temporary, that the investments in Iraq and Afghanistan were wasted, that the promise of democratic peace was premature. That's psychologically unbearable. The second reason is domestic politics. No leader wants to be the one who lost the empire or abandoned allies or retreated from global leadership. The political incentives all push toward maintaining the status quo, even when the status quo is unsustainable. Eden couldn't accept being the prime minister who lost Suez. Can you imagine an American president willingly presiding over the end of American hegemony? The domestic backlash would be enormous. But here's what's haunting. There is a better path. History shows it. Look at how Britain eventually managed their decline after accepting it. They maintained enormous soft power through language, culture, finance, and institutions. London remained a global city. British universities, media, and legal systems remained influential. They transitioned from hegemon to influential middle power. It wasn't what they wanted, but it was dignified and sustainable. The key was accepting reality early enough to manage the transition, rather than being forced into it by crisis. For America, this would mean a strategic retrenchment, reducing commitments to match resources, prioritizing core interests, building coalitions rather than acting unilaterally, accepting a multipolar world. The tragedy is that this is incredibly difficult to do. It requires leaders to make unpopular choices, to endure criticism for weakness, to abandon the rhetoric of exceptionalism. So here's the question that should haunt every American policymaker, every strategist, every citizen. Can America learn from Britain's mistake, or are we doomed to repeat it? Can we adapt to multipolarity before crisis forces adaptation? Or will we cling to the illusion of hegemony until reality imposes itself through humiliation? The honest answer is we don't know. The structural pressures pushing toward the British path are immense, but we have something Britain didn't. We have their example. We can see what happens when denial meets reality. We can see the costs of the commitment trap. We can see how the gap between pretense and capability becomes unbridgeable. The question is whether we'll use that knowledge. Now, some of you watching this might think, this is interesting history, but what does it mean for my life? Here's what it means. If we're living through a power transition from American unipolarity to multipolarity that has profound implications for everything, trade patterns will shift. Alliance structures will change. The technological competition with China will intensify. The dollar's role as reserve currency may be challenged. For younger people especially, you're going to live through the most significant geopolitical transition since the end of World War II. The world order that seemed permanent, it's not. Understanding this pattern, how hegemonic powers decline, how they resist decline, how that resistance creates crisis, that's not abstract. That's the framework for understanding the next 30 years of history. And it means making personal decisions with this context in mind. Where to build a career, what skills to develop, how to think about the future. Because whether America repeats Britain's mistake or charts a different path will shape everything. Let me leave you with the most important insight from all of this. Empires don't end because they become weak. They end because they refuse to accept that they're becoming weak. Britain in 1945 was still formidable. If they had accepted their new status and adapted accordingly, they could have managed a graceful transition. Instead, they pretended nothing had changed, overextended themselves, and faced humiliation at Suez. America in 2026 is still the most powerful country on earth. But power is relative, and the gap is closing. The question isn't whether America can maintain unipolarity. It can't. No one can, forever. The question is whether America will adapt to multipolarity strategically, or resist it until crisis forces adaptation. History suggests resistance is more likely. The psychological traps are too strong. The institutional inertia is too great. The domestic politics are too fraught. But history also shows that awareness can change outcomes. Britain's mistake is now visible. We know what happens when hegemonic powers deny decline. We know the costs of the commitment trap. Maybe, just maybe, that knowledge will be enough to chart a different course. So I'll ask you again, where are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments and tell me, do you think America is repeating Britain's mistake, or is this time different? I genuinely want to know what people from different parts of the world are seeing. Because this transition isn't just about America, it's about the entire global system. If you found this valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand these patterns. Subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. And remember, the empires that survive aren't the strongest. They're the ones that adapt. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.